I want to tell you about a single sentence published this week in The Atlantic by a man whose entire professional life has been spent building the intellectual architecture of American military intervention abroad. The sentence states, in effect, that Iran has defeated the United States and Israel. The man who wrote it is Robert Kagan. I have spent 30 years watching neoconservative thinkers manage strategic disappointments. I have watched them rationalize the failure of Iraq. I have watched them recast the chaos in Libya as a partial success. I have watched them blame Obama for Syria, blame Trump for Afghanistan, blame Biden for Ukraine, blame everyone except the doctrine itself. The one thing I have never seen a senior neoconservative do in 3 decades of watching the movement operate is publicly declare the project finished. That changed this week. Kagan is not a peripheral figure. He is the co-founder of the Project for the New American Century, the policy outfit that more than any other single institution shaped the American foreign policy posture of the early 21st century. He is married to Victoria Nuland, the former Assistant Secretary of State, whose handprints sit on every major American intervention in the post-Soviet space from Bosnia to Ukraine. Together, they constitute one of the most influential foreign policy households in modern American history. When Robert Kagan writes that the project is dead, it is not because his sentence makes it dead. It is because his sentence is the final administrative confirmation of an operational reality that the events on the ground had already established beyond serious dispute. The funeral notice in The Atlantic carries a particular kind of meaning that requires careful framing. Kagan is not mourning a strategic loss in the way a general mourns a defeated army. He is mourning, in the language of a parasite who has lost a host, the death of the American capacity to sustain the doctrine he spent his life selling. For decades, the neoconservative project depended on a specific American posture, a population willing to fund permanent military deployment, a Congress willing to authorize indefinite commitments, an officer corps willing to translate political ambition into operational planning, an economic foundation deep enough to absorb the costs of all of it without breaking. Iran has just demonstrated in the most concrete terms possible that the foundation has cracked. Kagan can read the cracks as well as anyone. The Atlantic essay is his exit interview. What I find most operationally significant about this moment, and I want to be precise about why this matters, is what it reveals about the psychological condition of the man currently occupying the Oval Office. President Trump has not publicly conceded anything. The official line from the White House remains that the operation against Iran was a success, that American objectives have been achieved, that the strategic balance in the region has been improved. But I have spent enough years observing how Washington behaves when a strategic position has actually collapsed to know the difference between confidence and the performance of confidence. The president is performing. He is performing for the cameras, performing for the base, performing for himself. Behind the performance is a man who has just discovered that the principal instrument of his foreign policy approach, the psychological bluff, has stopped working. Donald Trump has run on bluff for his entire public life. The real estate career was bluff. The reality television career was bluff. The first term foreign policy operated as bluff. The second term has been an extended exercise in psychological coercion directed at adversaries who Trump assumed would fold the moment American pressure became serious. With weak European leaders, he could afford to bluff. With Venezuela, he could afford to bluff. With Iran, the bluff was cold, and the call has produced an outcome that the architecture of Trump's self-image cannot easily absorb. What used to be marketed as Project Freedom has been replaced operationally by something closer to Project Nowhere, a holding pattern in which the rhetoric of dominance continues while the strategic initiative has already been lost. The contrast with Eisenhower is worth holding for a moment. Dwight Eisenhower had lived through the Second World War at the level of supreme command. He had personally watched the cost of waging total war. He understood, in a way that no American president since has genuinely understood, that the American population would not sustain long, brutal conflicts, that the manpower base of the country could be exhausted faster than the political class wanted to admit, and that American military power had real, definable limits beyond which it could not be pushed without breaking. Trump has none of that institutional memory. Trump approached the Iran confrontation as a child approaches a candy store, certain that he could take whatever he wanted because no one had ever effectively told him no. The Iranian state told him no. The mechanism by which it did so is now the central strategic data point of this decade. Inside the White House, what one source familiar with the discussions described to me as a deliberate cultivation of a sealed environment around the president has produced a decision-making process in which no one with serious objections to the Iran operation was ever physically present to express them. The popular narrative now circulating that Vice President Vance privately opposed the operation but loyally executed it, that General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised concerns that were overridden, that Secretary of State Rubio counseled restraint requires careful interrogation because the operational record does not support it. The vice president was, according to people who watched the deliberations up close, among the most enthusiastic advocates for direct military action against Iran. That posture is fully consistent with the financial relationships that brought Vance into political prominence in the first place. Peter Thiel, the principal backer of Vance's political career, owns a substantial stake in Palantir Technologies, the data analytics firm whose largest single client base sits inside the American defense and intelligence community. Companies of that profile do not lose money on prolonged regional confrontations. They make fortunes on them. Vance was not the dissenter the public relations apparatus is now retroactively trying to construct. He was the inside advocate for exactly the operation that has produced the outcome we are watching unfold. General Kane, for his part, was not appointed to the chairmanship to say no to anything. He is an Air Force officer in a position that, under the current administration, has been deliberately shaped to facilitate the use of air power as the primary instrument of American military expression. Air Force generals tend, as a matter of institutional formation, to believe in the strategic decisiveness of air power. The Iran operation gave General Kane an opportunity to test that belief in operational reality. The belief did not survive the test, but the institutional posture that produced the belief remains intact, which means the lesson is unlikely to be absorbed in the way that serious strategic recalibration would require. The narrative now being floated behind closed doors in Washington that President Trump was misled by his Israeli friends, that had he listened more carefully to his American advisors, the operation might have proceeded differently, is a piece of historical revisionism that the documentary record will not eventually support. The pattern of the past several months matches the pattern that President Lyndon Johnson exhibited in 1964 and 1965 in the run-up to the Vietnam escalation. The president and his inner circle were driving the escalation. They sought advisors who confirmed the direction they had already chosen. They marginalized or excluded the voices that would have complicated the choice. And when the operation produced the outcome that the marginalized voices had predicted, the inner circle began constructing the alibi that someone else had been responsible all along. Trump is now in the alibi construction phase. The Israelis are the convenient scapegoats because their behavior across the operation has been visibly maximalist, and their domestic political imperatives have been transparently independent of American strategic interest. But the truth is that Trump owned this operation from beginning to end, and Vance owned it with him. What the air power delusion that produced this catastrophe actually rests on is a generation of American military experience that was systematically misread at the time and has been systematically misremembered since. In 1995, American aircraft conducted strikes against Serbian positions around Sarajevo during the Bosnian conflict. The American military establishment subsequently concluded that those strikes had been the decisive turning point in producing the Dayton settlement. People who had been on the ground during that period, including British and French artillery officers operating alongside the American air component, were uniformly clear that British and French artillery had done substantially more damage with substantially greater precision than the airstrikes had achieved. Their analysis did not penetrate the American institutional self narrative because the institutional self narrative required air power to be the answer. Richard Holbrooke, the American diplomat who brokered the Dayton settlement, became one of the most enthusiastic public advocates of air power as the central instrument of American strategic effect. The Kosovo campaign of 1999 carried the same lesson forward in even more distorted form. General Wesley Clark conducted 78 days of aerial bombardment that produced limited strategic effect until Strobe Talbot, the Deputy Secretary of State, was dispatched to Moscow to persuade the Russians to abandon their Serbian allies. The actual decisive moment in Kosovo was diplomatic, executed through Russian leverage against Belgrade. The institutional self-narrative recorded it as a triumph of air power. By the time we reached Iraq in 2003, the air power delusion had hardened into doctrine. By the time we reached Iran this year, the doctrine had become a substitute for thinking. The neoconservatives understood at some level that air power alone could not produce the political outcomes they sought, but they consistently overestimated their ability to produce those outcomes through the air component while consistently underestimating the staying power of the societies they were attempting to coerce. Iran is the society on which that pattern has finally and decisively broken. The Iranian state did not crack under bombardment. The Iranian society did not fragment. The Iranian missile capability did not collapse. The Iranian nuclear program did not surrender. Every operational objective that the air campaign was supposed to achieve was either not achieved or was achieved in ways too partial to constitute strategic victory. The consequences are now manifesting in places that the operational planners did not adequately consider. The inflation figure released last month, 3.8% for April, is the visible tip of a much deeper economic disturbance that the war has accelerated. The disturbance affects four specific categories that have historically produced political instability when they move in the wrong direction simultaneously: food, feedstocks for animal agriculture, fuel for transportation and heating, and fertilizer for the crop cycles that produce the food. All four are moving in the wrong direction. All four are moving for reasons connected to the operational disruption that the conflict has imposed on global supply chains. And the historical record on what happens when those four categories move in the wrong direction simultaneously is unambiguous. Governments fall. The French Revolution did not begin in 1789 because the population of Paris had finished reading Enlightenment philosophy and decided to apply it. It began because the population could not afford bread. The pattern repeats across centuries with a consistency that the policy class consistently fails to take seriously. When people cannot eat, governments are replaced. I expect that over the next 12 months, we will see between 40 and 60 governments fall around the world, with particular concentration in Europe, where the political class has tied itself most completely to the American strategic posture, and in the global South, where the buffer between price disturbance and political collapse is thinnest. India, under Prime Minister Modi, is a particular concern. India had power grid problems before this began. The government launched a sustained effort in 2018 to address those problems, and that effort has now been overtaken by the broader disruption. A power crisis combined with a food disruption in a country of 1.4 billion people is not a manageable political problem. It is a transformational political event, and Modi did not ask for it, but he is now going to have to absorb it. The Trump administration is on the same list. The political coalition that produced the second term cannot survive sustained inflation in the categories that affect its core supporters most directly. The administration is going to look for someone to blame, and the someone is most likely going to be the Israeli government, because the alternative is for the administration to absorb the blame itself, which Trump is constitutionally incapable of accepting. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for his part, said only hours ago that the war is not over and must continue. He does not care what the war costs the United States. He does not care what it costs the global South. He does not care what inflation does to the governments that supported him. He wants complete Israeli dominance over the region, and he has concluded that the only path to that dominance runs through continued American commitment. That commitment is now politically unsustainable in Washington, even if Trump cannot yet bring himself to say so out loud. While the Western alliance system absorbs the consequences of its own miscalculation, the eastward shift in global wealth and power that has been underway for 2 decades is now accelerating in ways that the Iran campaign has materially advanced. Russia, China, and Iran are now more strategically aligned than they have been at any point in the post-Cold War period. The alignment is not an accident of geography. It is a deliberate construction that the Iranian state has facilitated through its central position in the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese-sponsored infrastructure project that runs from the eastern coast of China through Central Asia, across the Iranian plateau to the eastern Mediterranean and on into Europe. Iran is the operational hinge of that project. The Chinese and Russian assessment, repeatedly tested and repeatedly validated, is that the Iranian state has the social cohesion, the institutional resilience, and the strategic patience required to function as a reliable hinge under sustained external pressure. That assessment has now been confirmed in the most operationally consequential way possible. The wealth implications of this shift are not abstract. In 1492, when Columbus completed his first crossing, he opened the Western Hemisphere to European economic exploitation, and the resulting wealth transfer powered Europe through the next 5 centuries. The center of global productive capacity has now shifted decisively to East Asia, with China functioning as the principal production engine, the principal infrastructure investor, and increasingly the principal source of capital for the developing world. The United States has spent the past 3 decades squandering the wealth that the Cold War victory had concentrated in its hands, and the squandering has reached a point where reversal would require strategic choices that the current political environment cannot accommodate. China is going to weather this disruption better than any other major economy because China has spent the past 20 years building the stockpiles, the supply chains, and the strategic reserves that allow it to weather disruptions of exactly this type. China has also, and this is critical, consistently declined to engage in the kind of military adventurism that has drained American capacity. China is willing to do business with everyone. China is not interested in changing the political systems of its trading partners. That posture, sustained over decades, has produced strategic credibility that the United States has spent the same period systematically destroying. The military implications of the campaign extend beyond the immediate operational results. Scott Ritter, the former Marine intelligence officer who has been tracking American munitions inventories for years, has argued publicly that the combined drain on American precision munitions stockpiles from the Ukraine commitment, the Israeli commitment, and the Iran operation has reduced available inventories to levels that constitute genuine strategic vulnerability. His specific claims about particular munition categories deserve more public attention than they have received. The deeper concern is not the immediate inventory level. It is the structural reality that American industrial capacity is no longer organized to replenish those inventories at anything approaching the consumption rate that sustained military operations require. The reshoring of American industrial capacity that Trump campaigned on and has not actually executed would take a decade to produce results at scale. The conflict in the meantime is consuming the existing inventory faster than the existing inventory can be replaced. The alliance consequences are arguably more dangerous than the inventory consequences. The Iran campaign has produced strategic alignment among Russia, China, and Iran that the American policy class assumed could not be constructed. It has also produced a broader pattern of alignment across the global South against perceived American imperial behavior. The voices in Europe that warned about this trajectory, Viktor Orban most prominently among them, were systematically marginalized in the institutional politics of the European Union. Those voices need to return to influence quickly because the alternative is a Europe that fully completes its transformation into a strategic appendage of the American posture at precisely the moment when the American posture has lost the capacity to deliver the security guarantees that were the original basis of the relationship. I want to talk about something that the conversation in Washington consistently avoids addressing, which is the question of why the United States currently has approximately 28,000 troops stationed in South Korea. The deployment dates from the end of the Korean War, more than 70 years ago, and the basic agreement establishing it has given the United States operational control of South Korean forces during wartime, an arrangement that survives in modified form to this day. The original strategic logic that South Korea required American military protection against a North Korean invasion supported by Soviet or Chinese forces no longer corresponds to operational reality. The Chinese government has zero interest in supporting a North Korean invasion of the South. The Chinese government, if forced to choose, would prefer reunification under South Korean leadership because reunification under those terms would integrate the entire peninsula into the Chinese economic sphere on terms favorable to Beijing. The American deployment in Korea continues to function not as a deterrent against Chinese aggression, which does not exist, but as a structural commitment that produces tension with China on terms that serve no American strategic interest. We threaten ourselves in the strict operational sense more than China threatens us. The threats that actually matter, the southern border, the cartel violence, the fentanyl supply chain, the domestic economic disturbance, receive a fraction of the strategic attention that we lavish on threats that exist primarily in the institutional memory of the Cold War. The most consequential development of the past 48 hours, and the one that will shape the next phase of this confrontation more than any other single factor, is the statement from a spokesman for the Iranian government that if Iran is attacked again, the option of enriching uranium to 90%, the threshold required for weapons grade material, will be actively considered. Iran has not done this. Iran has consistently maintained that it does not want a nuclear weapon. But the operational logic that the American campaign has just imposed on the Iranian strategic calculation has changed the variables in ways that the campaign planners did not adequately consider. The message that the United States and Israel have just transmitted to every government on the planet that has ever considered the question is unambiguous. If you do not want the United States or Israel to attack you with relative impunity, you need a nuclear weapon. The campaign that was supposed to prevent Iranian nuclear acquisition has instead produced the strongest possible argument for nuclear proliferation across every region where governments are evaluating their own security postures. That is the legacy. The neoconservative project, in attempting to maintain American strategic dominance through demonstrative military action, has accelerated every trend that the project was supposed to reverse. American influence is contracting, adversary alignment is consolidating, nuclear proliferation incentives are increasing. Economic disturbance is propagating through systems that the American political class does not adequately understand. And the architects of the project, Robert Kagan among them, are now publicly distancing themselves from the wreckage in the pages of magazines whose readership they spent decades educating in the necessity of the project. The exit is not orderly. It cannot be made orderly. The cost of the exit will be paid for years by people who never voted for the project and never benefited from it. What replaces the project is now the question. Iran has demonstrated that a regional power with sufficient social cohesion, sufficient institutional resilience, and sufficient external partnership can absorb the full weight of American and Israeli military pressure and remain operationally functional on the other side. That demonstration is the central strategic data point of this period. Every government on the planet is studying it. The studies will produce strategic decisions over the next decade whose cumulative effect will reshape the international system more thoroughly than any single event since the end of the Cold War. The American policy class is going to spend the next several years working through the institutional shock of having lost an operation it was certain it would win. The world is going to spend the same years adjusting to a strategic environment in which American military guarantees mean something less than they meant at the start of this year. Robert Kagan can write whatever obituaries he wants. The corpse is already moving on without him. Leave your assessment in the comments. The conversation about what comes next, about how this transition is managed, about which governments survive the disturbance and which do not, is the conversation that matters most for the next phase of this decade. And your perspective sharpens my own. If this breakdown delivered the depth and honesty the moment requires, share it, hit like, and subscribe. The next update is already in preparation. Stay with me.